Appearance on Dion's Daily Dose does not imply endorsement from or by any candidate or guest. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by Dion Bergeron or Dion's Daily Dose are his own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of any guest. Material and information presented is for general information purposes only. The Dion's Daily Dose name in all forms and abbreviations are the property of its owners, and its use does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service. If you'd like to support the show, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/Dion's Daily Dose.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Dion's Daily Dose for Friday, September 25th, 2020. We have a very special show for you today. My friend Austin Bonta will be joining me, where we are going to discuss the absolutely real possibility that we may have someone other than a Republican governor in November. In January when it gets sworn in. But if you've seen the latest polls, you will see that it's a three-way heat. This is not something where when months ago we had Holcomb up by 80% or so. It's, in the 30s and 20s now all across the board. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Austin on, and we're going to have a conversation about what that may mean for all of the people who never thought it was even a possibility. So,
hey,
there he is.
How are you doing, sir?
Welcome, Austin.
Hey, I'm happy to be here, finally.
So if you could just real quick introduce yourself to those of you who may not know who you are.
Sure. So my name is Austin Bonta. I'm a business owner in Portage, Indiana. I previously, in a different career, was a special education teacher. But when my business took off, I ended up doing that full time. I've been a political candidate in Portage once. Wasn't successful the first time around. But I will say that I got, I think, more votes than any Republican who ever ran for that position before. So it was off to a good start. I would also mention that I am one of the two co-founders of Portage Republicans GOP, the Facebook page that I think a number of people watching the show might be familiar with. That was co-founded by Antonio Gutierrez and myself. And together we do the GOP Live broadcast where we interview different candidates. I know you've been on our show twice, and we hope to have you back on sometime as well.
I look forward to it. And I want to say that a lot of the stuff that Austin and we started talking about this a couple of days ago, and we were talking about the potential, the maybe, what if, and he told me some stuff that I didn't know regarding the powers of the governor and what happened and how it was set up and the reasons for it, and I'll let him expand on that. But I said, this would be a great discussion to have so that everybody can also watch and see. Real quick, Jack, thank you for joining us. Dave, we appreciate the support. I'll let you start, but I'm gonna put the question out there. I said, as a Republican candidate for office, obviously I support all the Republicans on the ballot, but I'm hearing a lot of rumbling, especially once the mask mandate was extended, from Governor Holcomb. There are a lot of vocal voices that are like, I want this person for governor or that person for governor instead of Governor Holcomb. Obviously, he has a challenger that is a Democrat, Woody Myers, and he also has a libertarian candidate that prior to this election, I would have said never stood a chance. However, with the latest polling being, I think, 34, 30, and 24, thereabouts. Don't quote me on those figures, but thereabouts. It's definitively a three-way race right now. And we could potentially end up with a Democrat or libertarian governor. If that happens, does the sky fall doomed? Is that the end of our freedom?
So to start, and I'm not going to go too into this topic because I'm going to create a little bit of a comparison. As a Republican who lived through 2016 and who's living through 2020, I'm always inclined to always say never just trust the polls. One of my favorite old jokes about polls is, I think this was a number of years ago, back when marijuana legalization was still unheard of in most places. And there was a joke that somebody had of some poll that said, 60% of Americans support legalizing marijuana. And then the person announcing this said, but to be fair, that was the majority of people who were willing to answer the phone at 12 o'clock in the afternoon and take a full survey via the telephone. So good humor there. But that said, you got to take polls with some grain of salt. I won't go too much into that, but kind of moving a little bit more into what does happen in any situation, whether we have, let's say, and not even necessarily in 2020, 2021, but in the way Indiana is set up, if we were to have a Republican legislature, but a Democratic governor, a libertarian governor, or even if we were to one day have a more contrarian Republican, if you will, maybe someone who's not as mainstream, kind of think like a Donald Trump compared to the establishment Republicans, if you will. How is Indiana set up that way? And I think that the answer surprises a lot of people. And that's that the Indiana governor position, by its setup, is actually one of the weakest governor offices in the country. Compared to most of the other states, the other 49, our governor's power is quite limited, and it goes back to the very beginning of our state's history. You see, when Indiana was a territory, we had a number of, I shouldn't say a number, it was a small number, but we had some very powerful territorial governors, the most famous one being William Henry Harrison, who defeated Tecumseh, went on to become president for, I think, 30 days. Tough guy, tried to give his speech out in the rain, got pneumonia, and that was that. Led to a great Parks and Rec joke, though. So anyway, when Indiana's state constitution was formed, there was a very powerful faction of anti-governor delegates who dominated our state convention that set it up. And so when they created the office of Indiana governor, they did some very unique things. One, they didn't give our governor total control over the militia. They also limited, at the time, that's changed since, the governor was originally limited to a 3-year term, and the governor didn't even have the ability to propose a budget. And so that was this first setup of the state. Also, something that was true then, and it remains true to this day, is unlike, I believe, every other state, and certainly the presidency, when the legislature everywhere else passes a bill, it goes to the governor's office, governor signs it, and then, or if he is opposed to it, he can veto it. So what'll happen is it goes back to the house it originated in, and then they have to override the veto by a supermajority. In Indiana, that's not the case. If our governor vetoes a bill in Indiana, this has been true from the beginning of our state to now, it only takes a simple majority of that house to override the veto, which is actually why when you look through Indiana's history, most governors, unless they really were trying to make a point, didn't even bother with vetoes because they knew that it's just symbolic. And that's a terribly unique thing. It's actually, in my opinion, kind of a lack of check and balance, regardless of how much it might serve one particular person or interest at a time. I actually do myself think that that's a little bit too odd, but that's been how Indiana's done it from the beginning. In particular, though, as the state kept going, this kind of push to limit the governor's power continued. The 1851 Constitution of the state took it very far when they actually took away the governor's ability to appoint his own cabinet, making them all elected positions. I think I should also mention that the 51 Constitution ensured that the governor had no ability to do consecutive terms. And it, as I say, took away the ability to propose a budget. Things started to change in Indiana during the Civil War, where it gets a little bit more interesting. We had, at that time, at the start of the Civil War, we had a Democrat-controlled legislature. Remember, we're talking about the Civil War Democrats, not the Democrats of today. And we had a Republican governor who had been elected along with Lincoln. Indiana voted for Lincoln in his first presidency, or his first term, by a 51% margin. The governor at the time, Henry Lane Smith, though, he resigned almost immediately into his office to become a senator in Washington. And so that was when the lieutenant governor, that was Oliver P. Morden, moved up and became the governor through the duration of the Civil War. If anybody's watching who went to Morden High School in Hammond, or if you know that name and you think, I wonder who that Morden is, that was our Civil War governor, arguably one of the most powerful governors in Indiana history. He faced the difficult situation where, although he was a Republican governor and we had a Democratic legislature, throughout the Civil War, the Democrats in Indiana were getting increasingly pro-South. Of course, we use the term Southern sympathizer, was how they would call it. And as it became more concerning that they might try to make a move towards secession and joining up with the South, him and the Republicans came up with a bit of a trick. What they did was what I call the quorum trick. You had all but 4 of the Republican legislatures refused to go to Indianapolis for the legislative session. The 4 who went, they called for a quorum check, and when there was no quorum, they couldn't do any business. And so during that time that the Democrats in Indiana were in power, they had no ability to get anything done because they never had enough people in the legislature to work during that session. Now, that also meant that they weren't approving any budgets. There was no funding being allocated. The way that Morgan got around that is he actually secured personal loans to run the state with. And then because there was no ability for them to discipline him, he went about making hiring choices that the legislature was supposed to control at the time, basically ran the state himself with these private funds. Then in 1864, when Republicans took control of the state legislature, they absorbed those private loans he took into the state debt. And they made a bit of a resolution to commend what he did to keep us going through the Civil War without going to the South. Let's see here. We started to get a little bit different basically between 1889, 1895. That is more or less when the legislature started taking back its power from the governor, basically went from Morgan's high-end power to the legislature taking it back, in particular taking back the ability to do hires for state offices and in general the appointments. To give you an idea, that kept going. When you look through Indiana history, there's a bit of a tug of war with some governors in the legislature, especially when they were in different parties. It wasn't until 1941 we had the Indiana Supreme Court ruling Tucker versus the state, which for the first time actually declared the governor was the head of the state government, or I should say the chief executive, and that Indiana's legislature was from that point on not able to restrict his constitutional authority at will. Up until then, the Supreme Court of Indiana had, on a couple of occasions, said that our legislature had the ability to even take away the governor's constitutional authority when they'd like. But Tucker versus the state has been in effect since. During the 70s, under a number of popular governors, we started to give more power to the chief executive, but again, even in a limited capacity. One of the biggest ones is that in the 70s, we gave the governor the ability to appoint judges, state judges, but even there, unlike other states, and I think also the federal level, as we're waiting for the official announcement tomorrow from our own president, there is a judicial nomination convention that gives the governor choices of who to pick for judge, and then he picks among those choices. They can't be generated straight up from the governor's office. The biggest thing that they did also is that they gave the governor the ability to have 2 terms consecutively, which again, that was very much a huge deal in Indiana since we had banned that for such an amount of time. And then the biggest one is that they finally gave the governor the ability to prepare a budget, which I believe every other governor by that point in the country was doing. In Indiana, it was a historic event.
Right.
Still though, in Indiana, the legislature can override the governor's veto by a simple majority. He has
That's crazy if you think about it. I mean,
yeah.
The very fact that it passed through the House shows that they have the majority, even a simple majority. So, like, it is like you said, or is symbolic only.
Right. You almost get the idea. I don't know if I'm qualified enough as a historian, and certainly not when it comes to the legalese, but it almost seems as if for a long time Indiana's governorship was like a pass-through entity. It was kind of like, okay, we're a state in the United States, we have to have a governor, but let's just make it something that stamps and moves, at best what we want to do. So that's where I think we have this weird symbolic veto. But then the other big deal in Indiana is that the governor has no pocket veto. So if the governor doesn't sign it within a certain amount of time, it just becomes a law. There's actually one famous incident in Indiana history. This was in the 1890s when Governor Claude Matthews, I had to double check his name because I didn't know the name offhand. I heard the story before. They actually locked him out of the state house to prevent him to turn in his signature, his signed bill on time.
Oh, wow.
So, because in that case, they actually wanted it to, or I'm not signed, I'm sorry, thing on time, they wanted it to become, a law through, him not having the pocket veto.
Right.
Legislature still technically has control over hiring, but because of the fact that the state government is so much bigger than it has been through the 1800s and most of the 1900s, that's much harder for them to discipline nowadays, other than just ensuring that merit-based hiring is going on. And even to this point, though, the governor, under statute, only has control of about half of the state agencies. State police is one, Bureau of Motor Vehicles, but the rest are all moved around to the other elected, what we would call cabinet positions, which, as we know in Indiana, we all vote for, as well. So You might be interested to think about how You wouldn't necessarily know this watching the news, even the last 8 years or so. And partly that's because we have right now a Republican supermajority controlling our legislature. And under the governorships of Mitch Daniels, Mike Pence, you had people who very much were the leaders of the Republican Party. We could say the same about Governor Holcomb today. When you've got a supermajority and the governor, it's a little bit easier for that chief to also be the leader of the party that helps set that direction. But in terms of what happens if you have enough of a legislature that's in conflict with the governor, they have the option to, in many ways, take that statutory power of the governor, and they can take it away. Some things they couldn't do right away, of course. There are constitutional powers that now, because of the Tucker ruling, they can't deny the governor like they did in the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s. However, so much of the governor's power in Indiana is based on state statute, and so it's simply a matter of the legislature adjusting that if they feel that they don't want a particular governor to have that kind of power. So I think your question was primarily geared toward rainwater. It could also be geared toward Myers.
Either way, a governor that takes power that isn't of the primary controlling, especially in our case, a supermajority, being a Republican, the Republican supermajority. But let's say for whatever reason that the majority of the citizens of Indiana, the voters, decide that we want someone else governorship. They choose either one, Myers or they win the election. Oh my goodness. Now in other states we've seen, and obviously the mask mandate is a rub for a lot of people. It bothers them. We're not going to get into that, whether, how anybody feels about it. But there are bigger and other issues than just the mask mandate. The governor of a state has a lot of power. Mm-hmm. But you're saying that comparatively, the Indiana governor has actually less power than the majority, if not all, other states out there. And go ahead.
I would say that the governor of Indiana has a great deal of delegated power from the legislature. Not necessarily written that way in the Constitution, but in terms of how our state has historically been set up, the legislature's willingness to take power away from the governor when they disagree, give it when they agree. You have to factor in, of course, as I said, the fact that we're living in, I don't mean to say more modern age, but the state government is bigger now than it's probably ever been. That's not any one person's fault. It's just to say it's grown. And so it's a little bit harder for the legislature to police it as they did, say, between the Civil War and between the Tucker ruling in 41. But what I would say is that unlike other states, when you have a united legislature, especially one with a supermajority, and you have a governor in a different party, the legislature in Indiana has the ability to basically limit how successful or powerful that governor could be. The flip side of that, though, too, is that a lot of this rests on, does the Republican Party in Indiana maintain its supermajority in the legislature? I don't think I've seen any polls to suggest otherwise. So I get the feeling that we're still going to be looking at, based on, again, the polls that we got and what we know, it looks as if we're still going to have very Republican control of both the state Senate, the state House. And then from there, it's a matter then of what would be their relationship with the next governor, whoever it is. And I think we know how it would be if Holcomb is reelected, and I myself have endorsed Holcomb. I support that. Other things aside, we can talk out some other place. But what I would get at is you're looking at a very interesting situation if you ever have in Indiana a supermajority in the legislature and an opposing governor.
Right, and that's kind of that's everyone's fear. So let's look at the election itself. I've seen a lot of people that, first of all, I am not a believer in a vote for a third party as a wasted vote. I don't believe that. I think that is a straw man argument, and it goes into vote bullying and all kinds of other stuff. Regardless of who you identify with politically, if you believe in that person, you should vote for them. All other things aside. But let's say for a moment, because one of the big arguments is if you vote for a third party candidate, you're taking votes away from, for example, let's just say there are Republicans who believe that a vote for rainwater is ensuring that Myers gets elected. By not voting for Holcomb, you're ensuring that a Democrat's going to get elected. And that terrifies people. especially in today's environment. We're seeing that the radicalization of certain aspects of the Democratic Party, anti-police, and all this other stuff. What does that really mean? Well, let's say the election happens and Holcomb doesn't win and Myers does.
Mm-hmm.
Woody Myers becomes the next governor of Indiana, but we retain our supermajority in the legislative, the IGA. What does that really mean then? What can a Democrat governor do to burn this state to the ground? Because that seems to be what people believe will happen. I'm curious.
So again, I'm
How
not
much
a member.
damage can they do?
I'm not a member of the legislature, so I can't speak for them. I've never been, and I can't tell you from any experience there. I would point out that when you take a look at the Indiana Constitution, it's very important to think about what things does the governor control, what things are part of that executive office that are by statute versus what's constitutional. Because anything that's by statute, the legislature can take away. And keep in mind that a Democratic governor in Indiana with a Republican legislature, all of their vetoes will get overridden pretty easily. The bigger thing I think that matters, and I shouldn't say matters, but the bigger thing that I think to really think about in Indiana is the ability of a opposing executive, not just the governorship, by the way, to refuse to enforce a law that the legislature has voted on. I think that that is more relevant this time around, for example, in the attorney general's race.
Right.
I'm backing Todd Rokita very strongly because we know, and just to give you an idea of some things you care about, just for example, if you care about the pro-life legislation that Indiana has passed, we have a Democratic candidate for attorney general, Weinzapfel. I'm not sure exactly how many syllables are in the name. I think it's Weinzapfel. Yeah, he a lot of vowels. He's made clear that he is not going to enforce a number of our state's pro-life legislation. If challenged, he's not going to do as strong of a job defending it on behalf of the state. That matters a great deal because you might want this legislation passed, but you should also want it to be enforced. And I think you want to consider that as well if you're talking about especially a Democratic governor. You might have a number of laws, policies you want, but do you trust the person who might execute them? Are they going to do the best job? And then you have the issue, too, of unnecessary conflict. I agree with you very much that a vote for anybody is never a wasted vote. If you agree with somebody or if you want somebody in a position for any reason, you've got every right as an American to vote for them. But what I would point out as well, I shouldn't say but, I should say and, got to work on that.
All right.
And I think it is legitimate, though, to consider the strategy that you want to get things done practically. It's not to say that anybody's a waste, but you can use the attorney general example I gave. Another one is, let's say you're somebody, this is a hypothetical, say that you're somebody who isn't so much a Republican or a Democrat, but you are just blanket pro-life. Like that is to say maybe you're against the death penalty and against abortion at the same time.
Okay.
Odds are you're probably going to be picking between two candidates who are one's pro-life in the abortion sense and one is pro-life in the death penalty sense. I think it's legitimate to say, I have things I agree with both, but I'm picking this one right now because at least this one can get something done. Maybe you're voting for just a hypothetical, maybe you're voting for a Democratic governor in a state who's going to get rid of the death penalty. You know he's going to do that. You know that the pro-life legislation in your state's not going to be impacted. Or vice versa, maybe you know that the death penalty isn't going to be on the table in any way in your state, so you go with the pro-life Republican in that case. I think that it's okay to implement some strategy. I've got family members who purposely vote for opposing parties for different jobs. My grandmother, whatever she voted for a Republican, whatever she voted for the president, she always voted Democrat for the legislature. And same with governor. She always had this belief that you need to have them in opposition. Not everyone agrees, though.
I can see that. Eric has a good question, and there's kind of two here. When do the citizens take power? I would tell you, Eric, that the way to do that is by recruiting and getting behind candidates who have your best interest at heart and supporting them. Right now, and this is I'm speaking from knowledge here, the entire system is corrupt. It just is. There are so many issues at play that regular people aren't aware of. And I don't mean regular people as in beneath. I mean people that are not involved in politics, that don't understand the backroom deals that happen, the hand washing, you help the back, you help me do this and I'll help you do that. But his next question is, what if that scenario happens? Would the people be able to introduce a bill to limit power or term limits? Now, before I turn this over to you, I do want to point out that very soon, I believe next Sunday, not this coming Sunday, but the following Sunday, we're still working out day definitively, but I'm actually going to have the Indiana, I think she's director, I believe, of U.S. term limits on my show. And we're going to talk about how realistic it is. I signed the pledge for term limits. How realistic is it for the people to expect that this to happen? Can we get this happening? Can we get people that are going to do that? I will tell you that it is absolutely critical to hold our elected officials accountable. If you have a problem with something an elected official is doing or has done, let them know. Write them letters, call their office, tell them you need to change your mind or you need to do this. But it's a good question. How can we, as regular people, let's say I don't win my election and then I become just another concerned citizen, how do I make sure that my legislator, who, if I lose, will be a Democrat, a far left Democrat, does what I want them to?
So for me, it's a difficult question. I mean, I can tell you right now that when being in Indiana, we have a lot of places where one party has a strength. I live in an area where the Democrats in Indiana, they don't always win, but they almost always win, and they win enough. So do you, I think. They win enough that they often feel like they don't really have to worry about Republican backlash or opposition. Likewise, there's a lot of places across Indiana where you can say the same thing about the Republican Party. I think it creates a challenge too, because I know that in parts of Northwest Indiana, there are people who are registered Democrat, they run as Democrats, but then, I'm not going to name names, but you find out they vote for Trump, you find out that they vote for Macron or Young. I'm sure that in other places of Indiana, you might have people who run as Republicans because that's easier to get elected. Right. But then we get confused why people run on one thing, vote for another, and then just claim to be moderates as the excuse.
Right. You know what? That's a fantastic point. It really is. And it's one of the things that is so, I don't want to use disappointing, but it's frustrating. It can be frustrating about the two-party system is by running as, for example, a Republican, I am telling you by my party affiliation in general what my are. I am, as a Republican, I am pro-life. I am for smaller government. I am for the things that the Republican Party is supposed to stand for. If I run as a Republican and then I get into office and I start pushing Democrat ideas, it's up to people to run against me in the primary to let people know, hey, this guy's, we know the term rhino all too well because you know what I find interesting is rhino is actually a well-known term. Everybody knows what it means. Republican in name only, RINO. You don't really have the reverse of that as a Democrat. Democrats can pretty much do whatever they want voting-wise and not face the kind of backlash that Republicans do if the people believe that they're not living up to the promise they made as a Republican.
I think you raised two really great points there, and I think I can address both if you're interested. I think it's easier for communication purposes. I'm going to do the second one first. I think the reason why you don't hear a lot of accusations about, say, dinos, has anyone used that term?
Yeah, Democratic name only.
If we could get it going, that's catchy. But I think part of that is that with Republicans, and maybe what I should really say is with conservatives, even libertarians, which is basically our two factions in the Republican Party. You have more of a federalist wing, which I subscribe to a little bit more personally, basically strict constitutionalist, but is okay with a number of the powers given in the Constitution. We can get into that a little bit later. But then you have the more libertarian wing, which is, I also believe the government should be completely constrained to the Constitution, but I'm not as fond of using those powers in the Constitution either. And I think that there's times where we can have a great debate. between federalist-leaning and libertarian-leaning leaders. But in either case, whether you're a libertarian, so your standpoint is don't restrict the rights and freedoms of other people unless it's protecting some other person's right or freedom from being attacked.
Right.
There's a standard there that you have to follow. It's actually pretty easy to say whether an action or an opinion is a libertarian action or not. With conservatism, or at least American conservatism, which I prefer to call federalism when we're talking about like what is expected of an elected official, there's still a standard. It's the Constitution. You know you're going too far if you exceed the Constitution. I think when you have a movement, which is the left right now, which is do whatever you believe is good for other people, and often with good intention, it's a lot easier to find and loose in terms of what you want policy to be. That's where you can have Democrats who might be pro-business in their own way, but then very socially liberal, want to pay for free healthcare, want to raise taxes and whatnot, but they still have some sort of business interest. Or you might have opposite side, you've got very socially conservative Democrats who might be pro-life. They might be really in the party more for like the family, labor, union side of it. But I think that that's what creates that broader base because what's the word I'm looking for? Ideologically, there's not as much demanded on you to meet that criteria. I also think that's why it's so easy to throw the rhino label at people if they have a particular opinion that doesn't meet that standard that they're claiming.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that that's kind of the main way to say it. A liberal is someone who's liberal most of the time. A conservative is someone who's conservative all of the time. Seems to be the mindset that we have in American politics. So
that's a great summary. It really is, because it seems like there's a lot more flexibility on the left for, well, as long as you kind of mostly do this, it's okay. Whereas to the right, it seems as if people are held to a much stricter standard. If you do, like, for example, not to get into the entire history, but people look, and that by people, I want to make clear, vocal people on the internet, which who knows if there are 2 of them, 1,000 of them, 10,000, who knows? They're the people who scream the loudest. But people who have said, well, Holcomb's a rhino now because of the masks, because of the shutdown. And that's something that isn't being said of, like, people still call Whitmer a tyrant, but let's remember that Whitmer went far, far beyond what Holcomb did as far as state shutdown.
And I think that what you see there, and again, I don't want to put any words in somebody's mouth because I can't speak.
Right.
I haven't talked to him about this. I've only met him once, and it was very, very briefly for basically a photo op at an event I was at. But what I will say is I think that one of the struggles we have in, if not the Republican Party, I think in the right-wing movement in this country right now is that fusionism is breaking down. You know, fusionism was a concept that even if you don't necessarily know the term, you've seen the effects of it. And what it was is during the 50s, as the Soviet Union was coming to power, you had people like William F. Buckley Jr. and the National Review and other conservative outlets that grew at the time. They basically proposed this alliance. They said, let's get all the libertarians, in particular the economic libertarians, let's get all the social conservatives who also support the Constitution. We don't necessarily agree on a lot of big things, but let's unite and basically create a, if not an ideology, a party with a platform made up of pieces out of all of us that we can all tolerate. And we will use this to defeat communism abroad, fight socialism here in this country.
Right.
And I think that got us through, and even a little bit into the early 2000s. I think that now that we're at a point where the Soviet Union, or if communism in the direct foreign power sense is no longer, facing us, there hasn't been that same motivation to basically look the other way about those disagreements.
Right.
And so it creates harder to fuse libertarianism and federalism, if you will.
Right. And that's a great point, because people look at the demise of the Soviet Union, for example, and think communism is gone. Mm-hmm. They think that it's no longer a big concern. I would argue that it's an even greater issue now because it has moved to the underground. Rather than being an overt, easily identifiable threat, it is now a subvert, behind the scenes infiltration type of threat. And we're seeing it, in my opinion, all across the United States. We're seeing it in our universities. I'm not saying every single college out there is preaching socialism and in effect then to communism, but I am saying that we used to be able to look at, for example, the Soviet Union and say, okay, we got to be careful of that.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's much more of a behind the scenes ideology.
Right. And when it's that far behind the scenes, you don't feel that same need to make compromises to defeat this greater scope villain. I don't want to get too much on the mask stuff right now, but I can if we need. You could basically look at the situation with the mask mandate as within the conservative sphere as a libertarian versus federalist debate. You basically have one side who their point is, in order to be the standard that we want, you have to not give an order that someone has to comply to that doesn't restrict your own freedom. And the mask mandate, by definition, would violate that order. So if you're someone who adheres to a strict libertarianism, you're not going to agree with that mask mandate. Some might push it and say that you're protecting others from the virus, but that gets into that's when you're getting into some splitting hair kind of debate. But then the other end of it, a federalist would take a look at something like the mask mandate, and if you first accept the premise that the virus is dangerous enough and that the mask is enough of a deterrent or part of a system of deterrence, you could make the comparison of the mask as being, and I've had people call me asinine when I've tried to explain this, I'm not trying to be, but you can compare the mask to other things that for the most part we accept that the state, I mean like the state of Indiana, not the state as a whole entity like communism, the state, but you could make the comparison to requiring people to wear clothes, like when they go outside. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you've heard people make that claim too, and there's an interesting debate that comes when people do. But really and truly, as long as you're voting for low taxes, voting for pro-life, voting for a freer economy, what you're seeing in that debate is a federalist versus a libertarian debate. And I myself am a fusionist. I really do believe, at least at this time in American history and for a great time in the past, the threats of the left, the furthest extreme being communism, have been and continue to be great enough that we're better off being in the same boat than trying to have a federalist party and a libertarian party. But that means that we have to figure out how we're going to divide that across state lines. I think another big challenge is that we're a country that has increasingly national media, and it's getting easier and easier to communicate across the country. That means that we're expecting these parties to be in unison. When Eisenhower became the Republican nominee for president, he made the comment that there were 48 states at the time. He said, there's not one Republican party, there's 48 Republican parties. And I assume that you could say the same thing about the Democrats back then. You might have Republicans in one state who are more in that libertarian camp, Republicans in another state who are more in that federalist camp. Mm-hmm. It's getting harder and harder to do as our media is easier to follow nationally and as people increasingly care about the big federal issues over those local ones. To get back to the term limit thing, I think that that's an important question to understand. I myself am fine with term limits in general. If everyone agrees, like with them and kind of set it up, I kind of actually like how Indiana has it with our governor position. Not that this has ever been tried. I'm not sure if anybody will ever attempt, but in Indiana, for example, the governor is limited to 2 consecutive terms, but then 4 years later can run again. And so I myself don't necessarily think that every position has to be capped forever, but that there might need to be some required breaks in between. I think that what that does is it makes sure you're not setting up a system where somebody dies and then nobody remembers what it was like before they were gone. Going way back in history, that was a big issue the Egyptians dealt with when Ramses died. The guy lived to be 97 or 99, depending on what historian you talk to. By the time he died, there was nobody who, not only did nobody remember him not being king, nobody's parents had remembered them not being king. Going back, though, to 2020, though, I think what's actually, for the sake of the people having power, for the sake of democracy, small d, I would say that to some extent, I feel, I might be an outlier for thinking this, competitive elections are more important than term limits. I think that both are a good idea, depending on how you do it. But I think that one of the biggest issues that we have is that we got, I think, so many places where either the Democrats have such a majority, they always win. Republicans have such a majority that they always win. And I don't actually think the threat to democracy is that the party winner doesn't change. I actually think the bigger issue is it produces those rhinos and dinos, if you will. Right. Because if you've got enough places where Republicans always win and people just run as Republicans because they know they're going to win with that party, well, it doesn't really matter what they believe in. You're at best hoping for competitive primaries. Same
Right.
thing with the Democrats.
Mhm.
And so I think that it's hard because you can't really police it. If people move to a place and they feel one way, it's tough. That's why one of the big things I like to do as somebody who lives in a very Democratic controlled area of Indiana is Tony and I started the Portage Republican page. And the big part of that was giving people kind of a focal point, at least online, where so many of us are, right now, to see there are people in my area who care about these same issues that I do, who have the same general political philosophy that I do. And it's funny because one of the things that we were, if not criticized for, very heavily questioned on is we look at our posts that we do on that page. I would say about 80 to 90% of our posts are about either the president or some national issue. The other 10 to 20% are local, things happening in Portage, in particular the politics. And we were essentially told it should be all local at a certain point. And to what our answer there is when there's a local issue, we'll bring it up. But so much of what gets people politically engaged right now are those big national issues we're working on as a country.
Yeah.
And you got to get people where they're interested, and then you can get them all together and meet, and you can form a group that can tackle that smaller stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. One of the things that I will say, regardless of how you feel about Donald Trump, everyone from both sides can agree that either support for or opposition to Donald Trump is directly responsible for so many people getting involved in the political process this year.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, many of these people, if it wasn't for Donald Trump and either their hatred or love of him, wouldn't bother voting. As we've done for so many years, it's, what does it matter? And more than anything else, I would say that this election alone shows us this is why it matters, because you have to get behind those candidates that you believe in, or you're going to end up with cities that are burning. You're going to end up with homeless strewn across the streets, syringes. You have to get out there and vote. Whether it's, if you like that stuff, vote for that stuff. If you don't like that stuff, vote for the other side. There doesn't seem to be a good unifying message anymore, like there used to be. Everyone, for the most part, at least as far as the Republican Party went, was pro-life. Everybody went to church. Everybody did this. If you ran as a Republican, you were in this little box. One of my biggest concerns, though, I'm going to tell you, we're seeing politicians all across the nation, but even in Northwest Indiana, in some of the most heavily Democratic controlled areas, that are changing parties from Democrat to Republican. My concern is, have their beliefs changed, or is the Democrat Party moved so far? Ideas that were associated with the Democrat Party just ago are now migrating to the Republican Party and pushing the Republican Party from the right to the center.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think some of that, of course, it's a combination. I think that there are some people who might have always been actually more of like one ideology, if you will, but they were in a party for some reason. Or you've got people who their views change, or they feel that the party has gone, past them. I think the other thing that we're really seeing today, maybe it's because of social media, it's so much easier to see diversity and viewpoint. You think about back when everything was just a couple of cable news channels, back when everything was just the newspapers. You didn't, other than like reading the letters to the editor, which who does that often, you used to find yourself in a position where it was really hard to see just how much diversity and thought there was across the country. So it was easier to say Republicans are this, Democrats are that. The other thing I think we're seeing, and I think Donald Trump is part of this, I don't think he caused it. I think you can go back further to maybe Obama, maybe Bush, if you include some of the really pro-war, pro-Bush stuff that happened, possibly even Clinton. I guess I can't pinpoint it on one spot, but we've been seeing gradually this transition from seeing parties as vehicles that just get something done to being almost an ideology.
Yeah.
I think that there have always been people who you could joke that their membership to a political party was similar to their devotion to a denomination of a church or something. But I think we're seeing it more and more where that's what's expected. I do think that maybe it's that way that we're all nostalgic for the past, but I get the impression, looking back, there was a time where more people were like, well, I'm a Republican because I believe these things. But again, if their opinion changed on something else, they would say I'm a Republican, but I think this. Now we're increasingly seeing this demand of being a Republican as a standard. And Again, we're not seeing it so much on the left, as you mentioned earlier, but it still happens. We saw a little bit back when the Democratic primaries were still competitive this year in 2020. In particular, some of the attacks levied against Bloomberg. I think even some of the attacks, actually a number of the attacks when they were levied against Pete Buttigieg, I think actually involved very much questioning his liberal credentials. Because you looked at basically some of his policies in South Bend, and it's not that we would necessarily call them Republican, but he didn't prioritize some of the things that Democrats also often think somebody like him should. And so it's beginning. It could be that's the beginning of it, but to some extent, I hope that we don't reach the point where political parties are akin to being a member of a religious group or a denomination, or at least don't have that same kind of fervor. I think that ideology and party don't necessarily have to be linked. There was a time when we had liberal Republicans, conservative Republicans, and then we had liberal Democrats, conservative Democrats. Sometimes in our history, especially the national history, there were times where things got done because either the liberal Republicans and liberal Democrats teamed up, sometimes the conservative ones teamed up, and sometimes it flipped. I don't necessarily know if we got to go back to that. I do think it's nice having kind of that more clear cut, if you vote for this guy, this is what you're going to get. I just think that we're watching that break down before our eyes, and we're seeing basically a spot where there's just this kind of stronger standard to be considered part of the group now. I think that another big thing that I've always wished we would do, because so many people in any particular state don't necessarily know who their governor is, who their state legislature is. I really feel that on the ballot, it would be great if, in addition to the political parties, it also had in parentheses which one's the incumbent.
Right. Yeah, I didn't see that. As a matter of fact, I just watched somebody filling out an absentee ballot. They did a video on it, and it didn't have where people were incumbents. Normally, there's like an asterisk or an I or something. They were filling the ballot out, and there was no indication of who the current incumbent was.
And I think that that's important, because I think some people might not be able to tell you who their governor is, or who their state treasurer is, or who their legislature is, or who their mayor is. But if they don't like something, if you go in there, you still don't know. You can at least say, well, if I don't like how things are now, I'm going to vote for the opposite one. But not if that's not there. Maybe that's why they don't put it in there.
It could be, and it's interesting too, because what are they afraid of? By showing who the incumbents are, is that a, I don't want to say, secret squirrel way to keep people in, but it does beg the question of what's the goal there? Because we see that people win just because of name recognition over and over. The primary for Congress was the number one indicator that name recognition will carry you no matter what.
Yes, it will.
But
the good news for you is if you just stay on that ballot 16 times, eventually people get used to seeing your name.
Right. So we have to look at all the factors there. But I've talked to hundreds, maybe even thousands. I didn't keep track, but I've talked to a lot of people in District 9 that obviously, I'm running for. But very, very few of them, a handful, were able to name who their state rep was. And I don't think that that's uncommon.
No.
A lot of areas, people can't tell you. They can't tell you who their representative is. They can't tell you who their senator is. And that's unfortunate, because if you need something, especially if you are not happy with the way that the government is and you want things to change, your first step should be learning who your current legislators are, so that you can get on them for action. And if they're not doing what you want, get someone in who will.
When I was running for city council in Portage, and this only happened twice, but even so, I wish I was joking. This was in the height of all the James Snyder things that were going on in the news and all that. And I still had two people when I knocked on a door and explained I was running for, city council. They were like, they did the thing like you're saying. They're like, who's the council person now? How does that work? And I had to explain that I was running at large versus the district. And they said, well, who else is there like running right now? And I mentioned the mayor candidate. I had 2 people who didn't know that Portage had a mayor. And I'm like, okay. And that's not something I fault somebody for. A lot of people just move to a place for the geography of it.
Mhm.
And I think that that's always kind of the tricky thing, though, is how many people even necessarily know all the things that they vote for and what it impacts. And to be fair, some of that, how do I put this the right way? Some of that involves getting an interest in some things that you might not always be that interested in. Look at like one of the big things our state government in Indiana is doing right now, trying to get broadband to places that either don't have it or they've got that underutilized.
Right.
That's an interesting, well, I should say it's an interesting enough topic. When I hear that that's a big priority of our state government, I think, well, that's good. But I got to tell you, I'm not that interested reading up on all of the details of that. So
Right.
for me to read up all the details to then form an opinion of, do I think that they're doing a good job at it? And then form, if I don't think that this is perfect, do I think that the other party would for some reason inherently do it better?
Right.
That gets kind of tough too. And I think that the more state level, the more local you get, sometimes the harder that is. You know,
I agree wholeheartedly. One of the things that I had talked about earlier was getting broadband to farmers, right?
Mhm.
A lot of them, especially the ones that have children right now, especially, they have to do distance learning and stuff like that, and without broadband. And people in the city, obviously, their concern is, are we going to have how's the taxes going to work? Who's going to pay for it? How's it going to cost? How's that going to work? Unless you can explain to them all this stuff and how it's going to work, then they're naturally, well, I don't know about that. That's kind of not. And then there's so much information associated with it. How cell phone companies currently have basically a monopoly on broadband for rural areas, and et cetera, et cetera. Way too much to get into. But you're absolutely right.
And then imagine that that's your top issue. Like that's what you're like running for. Like that's like your main thing. Now imagine how many people you can explain that to, knocking door to door on their porch and getting them to care about that enough, especially if they're not somebody who would be directly impacted by it.
Right, exactly.
And that's where it gets so much easier to say, hi, I'm the Republican. Hi, I'm the Libertarian. Hi, I'm the Democrat. And you hope that something that they do care about, more often on a national level, trickles to them voting for you because they assume that you're like the person that they like at the national level.
Right, right. And Michael Adam believes that we need more parties in the system. What do you think, just personal opinion, do you think that adding more parties that had a real chance on the ballot, do you think it would improve things, make them more complex, or be pretty much the same as we have now?
So I think that the thing to start with is I, of course, don't think that we should ever be writing our laws in such a way that we're purposely stopping a new party or a smaller party, third party, from getting on the ballot. I don't mind the idea that there should be some hoops to go through to get your name on the ballot or to get your party on the ballot. I understand that elections are expensive. If we let every single person show up and make up their own party and sign up, that's a lot of money spent for somebody who's not taking it seriously. That is, in theory, why we have some of those rules, like getting signatures and getting approval for the ballot and whatnot.
Right.
But we know that there's definitely places across the country where that's abused to stop new parties from getting made and to stop third parties from having a chance. I think that in Indiana, I believe now under our rules, we have automatically the Republican, the Democrat, and the Libertarian are on every ballot as long as they have a candidate. And I'm aware that in this area, we've had some success. I shouldn't say we, but members of the Green Party have managed to get on the ballot, it looks like with some relative ease. Since I'm not in a third party and I've never started one, I can't tell you how hard that is exactly, but the fact that I see it makes me hope that Indiana is not as purposely anti-third party as some other places we know are. But I could be wrong. If someone's got more experience, feel free to leave a message in the comments.
Right.
But,
yeah, by all means, let us know if someone knows has
works,
verifiable information that goes against what we say. By
I think the question as to whether or not we need more parties, so whether at the state level or the national, we need like a multi-party system, that's an interesting question. Let me start with the federal. Remember that one of the big problems we've had since the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists turned into the Whigs versus the Democrats turned into the Republicans versus the Democrats is our national government wasn't made with parties in mind.
Right.
It's not like the British Parliament that's basically designed to have one party in power and then you have the opposition party and they basically just sit around and complain until they win. We have a system that, at least if you think of the government as its own entity that can think, it has this block where it thinks that every member of our Congress, Senate, presidency is an independent, and they have the same setup as if they all were. I don't think that that's ever actually going to happen. I think that was the good hope of our founders, that we would avoid parties, that we would follow Washington's advice. We didn't, and I don't think we can get that back in Pandora's box.
Right.
So, but that said, I actually think that you probably could, considering the fact that the federal government was made in the Constitution without parties in mind. I think it might be easier for someone to be a member of the Senate, a member of the House who got elected with a non-traditional party, or I should say not a Democrat, not a Republican, and then either caucuses with a party, as I think Sanders did, and I think Justin Amash did. Does Justin Amash caucus with the Republicans? I don't recall if he does offhand.
I'm not. I thought that he was a Republican and then changed libertarian.
He became libertarian, but I wasn't sure if he was libertarian who still caucuses with Republicans. Because like Sanders, for example, was an independent socialist, but he was part of the Democratic caucus.
Right, but yeah, he leaned Democrat or whatever. Yeah, he would. I'll take a look while you.
I think, as you're looking, I'll say I think that all can work. I think that if you're running for Congress, I think if you're running for the Senate and you want to be, or you identify as an independent or some other party, you're going to be able to get a lot done in our federal government as long as you're able to ally and work with the right people to get your legislation passed or to vote for the legislation you believe in. I would say that a number of our states were made at a time when the parties already existed. And so it's possible that a number of our state governments are designed, maybe subconsciously, with a two-party system in mind. The other thing I would point out too is that when you look around the world, there are some examples of countries that have multi-party systems, and often what will happen is that when you have a multi-party system, you start to have a alliance that forms. Usually there's like a center-left alliance of multiple political parties. Then you'll have a center-right alliance, which you might consider to be like your moderate Republican type people. And then there's usually a far-left alliance and then a far-right alliance. And then sometimes when one group wants to gain power in a legislature, the question is our center left big enough that we can run this legislature, or do we need to ally with the far left? And then other times you'll have the center right say, okay, do we have a big enough majority we can run this legislature, or do we need to reach out to some of these far rights? Or you have like what happened in 2010 in Britain, where the center right party, if you will, the Tories, they actually made a deal with one of the more moderate liberal parties to form a government because they didn't want to ally with the more extreme right that was in the parliament to be able to do that. Deals like that don't necessarily bother me if you understand that that's how the game gets played in your country or even your state. But in this climate where we're basically asking everyone to be the purest form, a libertarian, a purest form of a federalist, some sort of pure form of a liberal, I think you're going to face the same problem then if you have a multi-party system and they're forming coalitions, if you will. If we were to have, let's say in Indiana, a win that was made up of libertarians, constitutionalist party members, and Republicans, and individually they didn't have enough to control the legislature, but they made some sort of pact. Whatever agreements and compromises they made, I'm sure you're going to have people saying that they're not happy with that compromise, depending on who they are, like which party they're in and which one that they think is getting the most wins in that coalition. So that's something to consider. The other thing that gets challenging when you look at like India, for example, which has, now you've got the BJP basically finally being a majority party, but for a lot of India's history, you had these coalition governments made up of multi-parties, and sometimes you would actually watch an entire legislative process break down because of a single issue of one of the smaller parties. I think one example was where like a budget situation collapsed because there was one party that wasn't getting the bridge they wanted in this one particular town. And so because of that, they pulled out of the coalition, which led to other people pulling out, and then the whole, government breaks down, if you will. I'm not trying to create a doomsday. I'm not saying that will happen at every state if we have multiple parties. It's just, I guess you got to say that when that actually happens, or if that actually happens, that has cons as well. And if you're okay with that, well, then I think it works. You'll have some politicians who maybe work better in a system like that. Maybe you're somebody who even if you had a state where, let's say, the libertarians get close to winning, you might not be the biggest leader in your party because you don't play that whole like party strength game, but maybe you're really good at keeping a coalition together. So that might work out for some politicians better than others, you know?
Right. Well, we're getting up to the hour mark, so we're going to wrap it up. I put on the screen real quick. I'm going to throw it back up there. He was a Tea Party Republican. This is Justin Amash, turned Trump era independent, and then he switched parties to the Libertarian Party, and he's not seeking re-election. So I would assume that he was caucusing with the Republicans since Trump era independent. I don't know for sure though how I think it was a pretty quick jump from Tea Party Republican to independent to Libertarian, but I don't know for sure. But thank you seriously for coming on, and I learned a ton about how the governorship is restricted in Indiana, and I think it'll alleviate some people's fears about splitting the ticket, and if a Democrat does get elected governor, what can they do and how bad could it be? I think that
consider too, if you don't mind me jumping in really quick.
Yeah, by all means.
One thing we didn't talk about, and it's okay, but you got to actually consider, if more people know that, how many people who might consider themselves moderate Democrats might look at a situation and say, you know what, I might vote for Woody over Eric Holcomb on a typical day, but at the same time, if he's not going to win, or if he wins, he's not going to be able to get anything done.
Right.
They might vote for someone that they perceive to be a moderate Republican like Holcomb, who they know will be able to get some things done with the Republican legislature. I'm not saying I know that's in the mind of any moderate Democrat, but that could be the case too. And I'm sure that there are people on the further right end of our party who would not be happy about that on principle. And I just mean to say that also could play a role in this election, especially if it's not known for its extreme politics. We've got some far left people in Indiana, but really, like, our most famous politicians of either side so far aren't really that
extreme. They're generally I'm with you, and you're absolutely right. One thing I did want to say for anybody who's out there watching and is not sure about the AG race, I got a text from the Weinzapfel campaign who, they send them out to this massive list, right? And I think it's very important for everyone to understand that not only is Weinzapfel have absolutely no intention of upholding any laws we put in place to protect our unborn, he's also anti-gun. He absolutely falls with the far left on the Second Amendment, completely against it. He is endorsed by Moms Demand Gun Sense, the far left anti-gun organization that all of you have probably heard about already. He would not be good for our right to bear arms. So I'll just put it right there. I do support Todd Rokita as our Attorney General nomination for the Republican Party, and I really hope that he wins, because if he does, Zapfel wins, and I don't even want to think about how much of a nightmare that is going to be. Your vote is your vote. By all means, vote for the people that you want. But there are some really good things that have been brought up today, and it's things to keep in mind if we vote for a governor. Is, for example, if you're a Democrat and normally you would have voted for Woody Myers.
Thank you for forgetting he's there. I feel so bad. We said it on the Republican page not that long ago.
My understanding is he actually hasn't done much as far as campaigning. He's having a hard time raising money.
He almost didn't have a lieutenant governor candidate because nobody filed on time. I think the other challenge too is that the party, and this is something to kind of echo your point about the importance of supporting Todd Rokita, getting this particular Republican into the Attorney General's office over Weinzapfel. The Democratic Party is basically pumping all of their resources into Weinzapfel. If they can get Myers in, they're fine with that. But all of their money, their effort is going to the Attorney General, mostly because they know that it can actually do the most damage to the conservative libertarian agenda. and also because it's highly likely that they're going to run Wines-Apple for governor in 4 to 8 years.
Yeah, I agree.
And that stopping this now really should be a priority for anybody who falls on the conservative end on a number of issues, be that in the short term, guns, the pro-life issues, and in the long term, anything that could happen if we were ever to have a powerful Democratic governor someday.
Right. And look, regardless of every other issue out there, unless you are, if you identify with the far left progressives, and I mean far left, if you identify with those, Apple is your candidate. If you do not, if you are even remotely moderate, you have to vote. I mean, in my opinion, you have to vote Rokita because this guy, he's as left as they come. He really is. So I appreciate you joining us today, Austin. I'd like to have you back on another time soon, and we can expand on some other tracks there, if that's okay.
No, that'd be great. And I'm looking forward to seeing you soon at your watch party for the debate coming up. I'm so excited for that, man.
Oh my God, I am so overjoyed. We were able to get some stuff lined up today. We got Evolution that we're going to have a couple of their amazing creations. And I tell you, I didn't know they existed, a year ago? And not less than a year, introduced to their amazing food, their amazing desserts at a function I went to. And oh my God, we can't stay away. I think you'll feel the same way once you see what they're able to do. The guy who owns the place is amazing with chocolate. He is it's a small local business in Valparaiso.
Awesome.
And it's awesome. But don't forget to join us, whether you can come out in person, which we would prefer. But if you don't feel comfortable coming out, join us online for Tuesday, September 29th, for our first watch party, which will be held at the American Legion in Chester.
It's 100 people now.
Okay, they released some of the restrictions. So now it's as long as we have less than 500 people, and if we end up with 500 people, like reducing how many people we have will be the least of our concerns. Stuffing them into there's plenty of room for people. Let me make that perfectly clear. There's plenty of room, but 500 people, I don't think we're going to get 500.
I would point out, if you don't mind me jumping in really quick.
Absolutely.
If you know already that you're going to be watching the first Trump-Biden debate, why not watch it with a great group of friends? And why not watch in a way that supports a fantastic candidate for Indiana's legislature?
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, by all means, if you're going to be watching it anyway, watch it with us. So that's where we'll be. So without ado, I'm going to run my end banner here, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. God bless Indiana, and God bless you.
If you'd like to support the show, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/Dion's Daily Dose. This has been Dion's Daily Dose, hosted by Dion Bergeron. Executive producers Sean Holgram and Michael Beebe. Copyright 2020. Dion's Daily Dose, all rights reserved.